Welcome, everybody. We will get started in just a few minutes. We'll get started in just a couple minutes, everybody. Thank you for coming. Hello and welcome, everybody, to this briefing, The Humanitarian Crisis in Gaza and Obligations under International Law, which is sponsored by the Institute for Policy Studies. For 60 years, IPS has served as a resource for social movements, activists, advocates, and policymakers to pursue a political and social change toward a more just, democratic, and ecologically healthy world. My name is Khury Petersen-Smith, and I'm the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow in the New Internationalism Project at IPS. I want to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the Empower Change Action Fund and the Friends Committee on National Legislation. We are honored to have your collaboration on this briefing, and we're deeply honored for the panel we've assembled, which I will introduce now. Craig Mokhiber is a specialist in international human rights law and served as the director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights before stepping down this October. In a widely circulated letter that Craig wrote to the High Commissioner then, Craig called the current Israeli siege on Palestinians in Gaza a textbook genocide and highlighted the ways the UN has fallen short in addressing Israeli violations. Hani Almadhoun is the director of Philanthropy for UNRWA USA. He's lived in Gaza. His family continues to live there and has been directly and deeply impacted by the current Israeli bombardment and invasion. And lastly, Phyllis Bennis, is my colleague, the director of the New Internationalism Project at IPS, and has written extensively on international law, Israel, and Palestine. A word about this briefing. After a few more words from me, Craig and then Hani will present, followed by a response by Phyllis, and then questions and answers with the audience. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your window to ask for the discussion, and we will end at 1 p.m. Eastern. It is difficult to appreciate the human toll of the catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. Since the attacks of October 7th, which resulted in the death of 1,200 Israelis, more than 18,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed. 80% of the population is displaced, but simultaneously confined by Israeli and Egyptian borders, which also severely restrict aid, fuel, and food as they enforce an Israeli blockade. IPS has joined the urgent demand for a ceasefire and end the blockade and no further displacement of Palestinians. We are heartened by the outpouring of support around the world and in this country pushing for those demands. those demands become more urgent each day with a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation and numerous violations of international law, which we're going to discuss. And so I made a mistake. Actually, we're going to begin with Hani, and then we'll have Craig, followed by Phyllis responding. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it to Hani.
Hey, can you hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you for having me. I wish we were in better circumstances. I come to you from UNRWA USA's office here in Washington, D.C., where I get to work with another Mokhiber, my colleague Layla Mokhiber. She does our communications, and, understand you two are cousins. Uh, uh, it's a lot, I'll talk about UNRWA first and the screen, the situation, and then I'll pivot to talk about personal things in a minute. So right now, as we speak, UNRWA has a shelter, has 156 shelters for 1.2 million people. That's about 55% of the population of Gaza are sheltering in 150 buildings. And on top of that, some of those buildings are being bombed every day. So less and less shelters are available for the more and more families that they need the space. And as we speak, more folks are trying to find safe spaces in the north, whereas I know my family is there now and they're being emptied from the Kamal Adwan hospital to a school that was previously bombed. So it's a very fluid situation. We understand that UNRWA is the largest humanitarian actor inside Gaza right now. And with that, nobody's able to do enough aid for Gaza. This is a fact. Not much is being done in different ways. So, as some of you may know, I'll just walk you back. UNRWA has been around since 1948 with an UN mandate to protect and provide services and health and education for the Palestinian refugees. Gaza is one of those field areas where UNRWA works. We are in Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Jordan. But Gaza is always our biggest operation because if you look at Gaza, 70% of the folks in Gaza are Palestinian refugees. That means they are not from Gaza. They came from towns nearby. Like, say, my family, we come from a town called Asqalan in Arabic. It's Ashkelon. It's about 20 minutes ride from Gaza. So a lot of those communities are refugees inside Gaza. Prior to October 7th, we know that 80% of the folks were in a variety of food assistance program. UNRWA, about 60% of the population received food assistance from UNRWA because they've met certain criteria. There is a 55 to 70% unemployment rate. You look at the age groups and the gender, it changes, but it's not a very good situation prior to October 7th. And we just happened to be in Gaza in the summer. With the family for 3 months. We left on August 11th, and we are traumatized by this just watching from the TV because all those places and memories are still fresh. We look at UNRWA right now, and that's my work here at UNRWA USA is giving me a lot of serenity and hope because that's if I wasn't doing that, which is raising additional resources for UNRWA to do the work. So just to speak about what's going on in Gaza right now, in the first week of the war, UNRWA was working in the north, the middle, and the south area of Gaza. In the first week, UNRWA was ordered by the IDF to leave the north. And remember, that's where 70% of the population lived. So a lot of people moved south who could during, the 65 days, every now and then you get a fresh a group of refugees who are able to get there safely, sometimes not so safely. Some folks have been killed during making that journey, long walk of 10 kilometers or more. So as we speak right now, UNRWA delivered in Khan Yunis, but as of this week, we are not able to deliver aid anywhere but in Rafah. So remember, we started all Gaza, then the middle and the south, then no middle area, then no Khan Yunis, and the only town we're able to deliver aid right now is Rafah, which is, as you know, this is a border town with Egypt. I happen to have my sister there. She's sheltering a public school, and things don't look very pretty there. You know that folks are desperate for food. There is, in fact, some violence over some food fights and lack of resources. It is inhumane. It is obviously not a good situation. Despite that, UNRWA was able to bring in aid as much as we need. When we talk about aid, just talk about ready-to-eat meals, talk about flour, we talk about chickpeas, lentils, powdered milk, that's very essential, tuna, and some fortified cookies, like that. They have dates, so they give you high calorie intake per day. So those are the items we're bringing. In addition to, UNRWA is bringing a lot of those blankets that you look at and mattresses. It is not enough. UNRWA has already distributed 500,000 blankets, but that leaves us with 1.5 people who need blankets because people literally left their homes with the back, with their clothes in their back. So a lot of those things are not being able to deliver. Other priority is hygiene kits. This is a high concentration area. More than 50% or 50% of the population are under the age of 19. So there is a lot of things that we have to look out for. One of the sensitive subject is the hygiene kits, especially for female hygiene. That's a big issue that UNRWA tries to deliver a lot of that. And remember, you're overcrowding folks there. So if we talk about the school in El Maghazi, that's one school in the middle area that's designed to host 4,000 people in a regular time as a shelter. There is now 37,000 people in that school. That creates a lot of problems. That leads to a situation where one bathroom has to serve 1,500 people per day. And think about the long lines, talk about the pressure, the stress. A lot of those people are elderly who's going to wait for 3 hours to use a bathroom. And it's a lot worse with the case of a shower. So if you wanted to shower, you have to wait probably for a day on schedule if you can. So it creates not a less than an ideal situation. And now, especially with the winter, we're looking at a lot of high rate of infection with skin diseases for 3 times as much, stomach bugs and diarrhea and all that 4 times as much. And the new one is UNRWA got hepatitis. So there's a lot of those cases reported, especially with children. And it's a nightmare scenario. We have not talked about the bombs yet. We're just talking about what's happening inside the shelters. Unfortunately, despite everything, we have 20, UNRWA, the agency, has 22 health clinics in Gaza. We are able to only open 8 of them to provide services. And as you know, about every day, 180 women deliver a child or on path to deliver a child per day. So we provide a lot of those services, midwives and care for the baby, vitamin for the mom and the formulas and all that. So about 600,000 patient visits in those clinics. Remember, because there is a lot of trauma and people are hurting, if they can get to an UNRWA clinic to get medicine, and if we have the medicine, we will distribute it. But we're talking about primary care. And as you know, it's sort of not, it is an obligation to do that, especially during these tough times as the hospitals are crumbling. And, just as we speak, the Kamal Adwan Hospital up north, no water, no electricity, no fuel. How are you going to treat any people? I have many stories of people who died just waiting there and didn't have to die. People were shot in their foot and then 2 weeks later they're dead. So there's a lot of those things that UNRWA tries to work with that. So in a flip of a switch, UNRWA became the fuel delivery services for the hospitals and the bakery, because the Israelis wouldn't trust many people or entities in Gaza. They can trust UNRWA and deliver this aid. So UNRWA pivoted to doing partnerships with bakeries and hospitals to deliver aid as much as we can, because people left their homes, they're not gonna take their cookware with them. So we're trying to get the bakeries to do that, and we deliver the flour for free and the fuel. So what happens sometimes, the bakers charge a certain fee for people for their work. But if folks are inside the shelter, so we're talking about the 1.2 million, there is some essential sort of services that have been met. They receive flour, they've received some ready-to-eat meals, and those are sort of easier for us to manage the delivery. There is one thing that we don't think about. Remember, the police collapse. So who's going to protect an UNRWA staff going in a very desperate situation where people are not feeling safe and they feel like they're not going to go home with the bread they need? So it creates a lot of pressure. Whereas if you are working inside the shelter, you could manage that process better. There is naturally, we're looking at, in my personal opinion, a genocide, and that causes a lot of pressure and stress on folks. And not just that, it puts a very less than ideal situation. One thing that's UNRWA has been clear is the humanitarian ceasefire. We're asking for that. We're also asking for fuel. This has been, disruptive for our services. You could not deliver aid to Khan Yunis, assuming that there is no hostilities there without the fuel. And the other worst one is the communication. Oftentimes, there are days where UNRWA was not able to bring in aid because they couldn't communicate with the right authorities or the staff to go to deliver that. So that's also done by the Israeli occupation. I cannot talk to my family anymore, despite the fact them managing to get an Israeli SIM. So there is a lot of jamming, and not only just destroying the local towers for services like internet and phones. So that multiplies the dilemma we're dealing with. Another thing, UNRWA's lost 134 staff inside Gaza. This is the largest in the history of the UN. This number of casualties happens, and that somehow seems normal. Like I don't get the reaction like, wait, like this is a big deal, and that sort of frustrates you. And these are colleagues that work every day to deliver for folks. As we speak right now, there's 5,000 UNRWA staff working in the clinics, the warehouses, the shelters, but they're not able to do a lot of things. My family's in the north; they have not received anything. My boss got to the highest of UNRWA, like, can you deliver? And they said, no, there is no guarantee that we will not be bombed, yet alone to find routes to do that. So there is a lot of desperation happening, but it's no longer in the north. It's also touching the middle area. UNRWA was not able to deliver there. So we're really not even being able to call what we have as a humanitarian response. Another hurdle we're running into: since October 7th, zero commercial trucks have gotten into Gaza. This means no supermarket, no grocery store, nothing can be sold in the street of Gaza. So everything is going in as a humanitarian aid. See yourself, you may be a Palestinian in Gaza and you have some money, you want to buy food, you're out of luck. You have to go lose your dignity, stand in line for 10 hours. And some people, may run into risks from both the Israelis and from the chaotic situation. So we need commercial stuff to get in. UNRWA is the largest humanitarian act, and we're telling everybody we cannot. We're not equipped to handle this much pressure. Think about this number. If UNRWA wanted to bring in drinking water into Gaza, remember the Israelis shut the pipes, they started some of them back again for a few hours, and the fuel, you can't pump the water. If we only wanted to bring in drinking water to meet the local needs in Gaza, you would need 1,200 trucks a day just for water. And that creates a lot of issues with the recycling, and not just to say, when you hear people brag, oh, we got 100 trucks, which is the average now, we're getting 100 trucks a day. But those numbers are misleading. Sometimes there is a mismatch of what you need because the Israelis have a very tough security situation where they check everything to go, but they don't check it on the site. They send it 100 kilometers out, they check it, and then they send it back to be allowed into Gaza. And obviously, this is not an ideal situation. We can't get the aid we need. There's tons of food that's just sitting there in Arish, may expire, may be exposed to different conditions, and that's not helping us. So just to be clear, we ask for a humanitarian ceasefire. More aid is good. UNRWA was underfunded. We already have met a lot of crises during the last administration, but it is not a good, it is the trusted partner of a lot of those powers, and try the agency to deliver this aid as much as we can. But those conditions it became a lot harder. And in addition to that, we're getting hit by conspiracies from the Israeli side here that hurt us and keep us busy in Capitol Hill responding to rumors and unfounded information. And because of the frustration some Palestinians have because UNRWA can't get to them, we're also spending a bulk of our time defending and explaining how things work. And it's just really unfortunate. I'm very wrapping up here. My family remains in north of Gaza for a number of reasons. They are right now at Kamal Adwan. They were ordered to leave under the gun. In fact, last week, my younger brother was arrested. If you see these unclothed men, he was one of those folks, and we made a sort of a big publicity around it. They were released about 14 hours later. They were told to go to Kamal Adwan Hospital, and the Israeli just showed up there and took the men away. They told him to go someplace. They told the women to go to another place, so they're splitting families now. And that's just unfortunate because we cannot communicate with them. And this is happening literally like 2.5 weeks after we've lost my brother, my younger brother Majid. He was in his home with his kids. The Israelis, an hour and a half before the truce, they brought the whole building down on them. And oftentimes we have not processed the trauma. Like, we try to be resilient and strong, but, the killing is not stopping. I don't know where is the next memorial service we're going to hold for which relative. It is real. My brother has no affiliation with anything, the one they killed and the one they detained. And it's interesting because they said in the video he's a military operative. I was like, 100%. This guy cannot walk 2 meters without calling a taxi. He's not anything. I put everything on the line for it. And the Israelis got caught in a big lie and it escalated from there. Anyway, so I just wanted to be here, answer your questions, and let you know, we're there for Gaza as much as we're allowed to. But remember, UNRWA does not have bulletproof cars and vests to protect themselves, let alone, deliver aid for folks who really desperately need it. So thank you for having me. Back to you.
Hani, we can't thank you enough for the work that you do every day, but to be here and share your deep knowledge, your professional knowledge, as well as your personal knowledge. We are truly, truly grateful. So thank you. Let me now hand it over to Craig Mokhiber. Thank you.
Thank you, Khury, and hello, Phyllis, and hello, Hani. Hani, all of my condolences and solidarity to you for what your family and friends and colleagues have been going through, including the more than 136 UNRWA colleagues who have been killed by Israel just in the last several weeks in an unprecedented example of the horrors that are unfolding here. The UN has never lost so many people in this way. And we know that many of their families have been killed along with them and many more injured, showing that nobody in Gaza is safe from this onslaught. This is, the 75th anniversary of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention adopted in 1948. It is also, in a historic irony, the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, of the destruction of Palestine and the original genocidal ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. And I think underscores a very important point about the institutions of law and accountability that have been built up since the Second World War in order to try to prevent the kinds of horrors that took place during that conflict. And I think it is a massive indictment on all of those international institutions, on the international community, on governments like those of the United States, that not only have we failed in preventing these things and ignored international law entirely, but you have seen outright complicity on the part of powerful states like the US in the unfolding horrors in Gaza and in the West Bank, by the way. Now, most recently, we just had a vote in the General Assembly in an emergency special session for a ceasefire in which virtually the entire world voted for a ceasefire, but the United States again voted against it after having vetoed several ceasefire attempts in the Security Council, ceasefires that would have prevented thousands of subsequent deaths and massive destruction, but again, repeatedly vetoed by the United States in breach of its international legal obligations, I have to say. International law, including international humanitarian law, international human rights law, imposes an obligation on the United States not just to respect international humanitarian law, but to ensure respect vis-a-vis other parties over which it has influence, in this case, Israel. The United States has clearly not used that influence over Israel in order to get it to respect international humanitarian law, which has been grossly violated continuously during this entire assault. The United States also has an obligation under the UN Genocide Convention to act to prevent and stop genocide where it emerges, and it is in breach of those obligations. And in fact, interestingly and terrifyingly, previous genocides that unfolded, such as that in Rwanda, saw a breach of the US's obligations because it didn't take any action to stop them. Indeed, we know from leaked diplomatic cables that the US gave instructions to all of its diplomatic missions during the Rwanda genocide not to use the word genocide, because they know under international law they would have been compelled to act. That's one level of breach, right? Not taking the action you're required to take. But here we've seen something quite different, which is full-on US complicity. Complicity is a specific crime defined in the Genocide Convention, for which the US is now accountable, because not only has the US not acted to stop it, but in fact, in real time, during the horrific acts of this genocide in Gaza, the US has continued to arm, provide economic support, provide intelligence support, provide diplomatic cover, even to use the veto to prevent it from stopping as it was occurring. That is the crime of complicity under the Genocide Convention, for which the U.S. is now accountable. What we saw happening on October 7th and subsequently is a whole catalog of war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. No doubt, those on October 7th who may have committed war crimes like hostage taking, like failing to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and therefore killing civilians. These are war crimes for which the perpetrators, whether from Hamas or other groups, of course, need to be held accountable. And the US has been very strong in insisting on accountability for any perpetrators on October 7th, but it has gone silent and has refused to call for accountability for perpetrators, Israeli perpetrators that had committed war crimes, crimes against humanity before the 7th, during the 7th, and on a massive scale now since the 7th. And this is really important because the US has a disproportionate influence on Israel, which it has refused to use, and in fact has become a party to these crimes. It also has a disproportionate influence on the broader international community and international institutions, where you now see an open conversation about whether or not international law, international human rights, international humanitarian law will survive this direct assault by powerful states like the US and the UK. And I think that is an open question. The crime of genocide has gotten a lot of attention. And the reason it's got a lot of attention is because what we're seeing is unprecedented in a number of ways. I have said, and many others have said, and many genocide scholars have said, that what we're seeing is very much a textbook case of genocide. You don't often see such a clear violation of the specific terms of the Genocide Convention as we see Israel actually perpetrating now in Gaza. Genocide is often a very politicized concept. People use it where it doesn't apply. They refuse to use it where it does apply. It is, just by its nature, something that tends to be very politicized. But for international lawyers, it's clear, because you have this convention that sets out the specific acts that may indicate genocide and the specific intent that's required for those acts to represent genocide in a court of law. Both of those have to be present for a finding of genocide. Things like acts like killing, serious harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life that are calculated to bring out the destruction of a group in whole or in part. And then this requisite intention, to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. In this case, we have those acts very clearly manifest over and over again. Large-scale killing, 18,000 registered deaths now, thousands exterminated in a matter of just a few weeks, at least 8,000 children, 5,000 women, 5,000 men murdered in a few weeks. Actually, a huge number of whole multi-generational families exterminated, erased from the public register, whole bloodlines. More than 50,000 now who have been injured, many thousands still under the rubble, dying excruciating, slow, and painful deaths because it's impossible to get to most of them, and many more now dying of disease and now hunger. The majority of people in Gaza now suffering from facing starvation. You have this horrifying wholesale slaughter of an imprisoned population, whole neighborhoods razed to the ground, whole areas, the whole north of the Gaza Strip, now maybe 2/3 of the Gaza Strip, massive ordnance dropped on densely populated civilian areas, attacks on homes, refugee camps, hospitals, clinics, ambulances, schools, UN facilities, humanitarian facilities, all civilian infrastructure, right? And then you have this requirement of the Convention of serious harm, physical and mental. Well, thousands wounded, maimed, denied any adequate medical care, denied food, water, medicine, shelter. You know, the things that Hani was talking about, like the disease and the hunger, those sorts of things. This is not the result of a natural disaster. This is not the result of a drought or something. This is intentionally imposed disease by design, explicitly recognized by Israeli officials themselves. This is intentionally imposed hunger, denying people food, intentionally imposed thirst and lack of medical care. These are some of the most serious crimes codified after the horrors of the Second World War that Israel is now perpetrating. So that piece is clear as well. But then you have this thing that people often struggle with in the Genocide Convention, which is this idea of deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction, either partially or entirely. You know, Israel has imprisoned 2.3 million civilians in Gaza for decades now. Most of them very poor, again, imposed poverty. Most of them food insecure before October. Most of them children, most of them already refugees, because these are families that had been purged from inside what is now Israel in the ethnic cleansing that took place there. It has imposed a siege on the Gaza Strip since at least 2005, deliberately restricting the flow of food, water, sanitation, medicine, construction, free movement, everything necessary for a decent life. And since October, it's made that siege total, cutting off all food, water, other essentials in another grave breach. And you know, now more than 2 million women, children, men have been forcibly displaced, causing that further harm and calling into question their survivability as well. And they've not been shy about the deliberate nature of what they have been doing here. And of course, they've destroyed homes and schools and hospitals and churches and mosques and courthouses and food production, all civilian infrastructure, refugee camps, UN facilities, all of that. So when you have the interning of the people of Gaza over a period of years, the long closure and siege, rarely have we ever seen such a clear, self-evident case of Article 2C of the Genocide Convention on imposing conditions of life designed to destroy a particular group. But the most amazing thing here is the question of intent. And this is why I and genocide scholars and international lawyers and human rights activists have been saying we've never seen a case quite like this. You know, the International Court of Justice says because intent is often hard to prove, you can infer intent from conduct. And of course, we've had 75 years of ethnic purges carried out by Israel, in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and now in Gaza. That's already compelling evidence of the intent of Israel to carry out another ethnic purge in Gaza. But you don't even need to infer, because the climate of impunity under which Israel has operated now for decades, because of US support in large measure, has led to a situation where they're openly, we've never seen this before, openly and publicly declaring their genocidal intent on the record since the beginning of the assault. You know, normally you have to dig through dusty government archives to find communications proving that there was an intention to destroy this group in whole or in part. But in this case, it's being done for us by Israeli leaders. That's included the Israeli president, the prime minister, cabinet ministers, senior military officials, government think tanks, all of which have dehumanized Palestinians in Gaza as animals, subhuman, Nazis, a cancer, ants, vermin, all of the things that you're used to seeing in genocides being done in public. They have openly declared an intent to wipe out all of Gaza, an intent not to distinguish between civilians and combatants, an intent to raze Gaza to the ground, reduce it to rubble, to bury Palestinians with bulldozers, and explicitly to carry out another Nakba, which was the 1948, 1947, 1948 ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. And then you have the prime minister himself, who invoked to his troops and his public a biblical verse on the Amalek that commanded that, quote, the entire population be wiped out, that none be spared, men, women, children, suckling babies, and livestock all be killed. So in other words, they have themselves made the case for genocidal intent. And finally, I want to say something about the crime of complicity that is in the convention itself. You know, when you have such a clear and compelling case of genocide, And even if you're only talking about preventing and unfolding genocide, or even if you're only talking about war crimes and crimes against humanity, you have to think about complicity, including that of the United States. The Genocide Convention mentions complicity, as I said, as a separate crime. In this case, we've got the US providing this active economic, military, intelligence, diplomatic support to Israel, and the veto while it is engaged in unlawful actions. That is to say, not that these things were already in the hands of the Israelis and we don't want them to use them, but the US is actively participating in that genocide. You have official state institutions in the US government dedicating themselves to disseminating Israeli propaganda for war, including justifications for war crimes, false claims, by the way, that were supposed to be the basis for justifying war crimes and crimes against humanity, coming from US government podiums. The US has deployed its veto multiple times, after which many more deaths have occurred. And it has brought pressure to bear on independent international institutions to try to prevent them from holding Israel accountable. And I have to say, before I finish this point, this culpability cannot be overcome by what I think is a very transparent fig leaf harvesting exercise of Blinken and Biden and others in the past few weeks, who talk about securing a trickle of aid trucks or publicly urging respect for international law, because while it's saying these things, it has continued to arm and finance and protect the crimes that are being committed that could not occur without US support. That's the crime of complicity. So we're at a very dangerous moment in history. The danger to Palestinian civilians is already evident by the massive slaughter that has taken place, but also the danger to the international law framework and the international human rights framework that's been built up for the past 78 years should also by now be evident. And the US is very much active in damaging this international framework with its conduct in this current situation. I think, where we are encouraged is that we see that so many in the American public have stood up, have spoken out, Jews and Christians and Muslims and human rights defenders and peace activists who are joining arms and saying, absolutely not, this is not in our name. We oppose this. Some incredible actions, Jewish Voice for Peace in Grand Central Station and at the Statue of Liberty and in so many other sites around the world, standing up to try to strip away a propaganda point that tries to say that this is somehow, between Jews and non-Jews. Clearly not the case. Israel does not represent Jewish people, as I think anyone who follows this situation knows, and Israel is alone responsible for its own crimes. But where there is shared responsibility, it is with those governments that are supporting genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity as they are unfolding in real time in Gaza and on the West Bank as well. I'll stop there. I've probably said too much, but happy to engage in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Craig, for your extensive knowledge of international law and your detailed knowledge of Gaza right now. I'm going to hand it now to my colleague, Phyllis Bennis at IPS.
Thanks, Khury. I appreciate your own work on this. And Craig and Hani, huge thanks to both of you for sharing your knowledge, for bringing us closer to the realities of what we're seeing in Gaza. There's a very important point here that link the humanitarian crisis and the question of international law. One provides a solution, potentially, to the other. And ironically, we need a ceasefire for both. There needs to be a ceasefire to even allow humanitarian assistance to respond to the current crisis. We need a ceasefire to begin the process of finding accountability through international law. And the need for a ceasefire remains, despite yesterday's vote at the United Nations. It has not yet come to pass. The question of accountability is a tricky one, I think, because, as we all know, international law is not self-enforcing. Its most important role, I think, is to play the role of a tool for people and for political movements, for social movements, to use as an instrument to press for ending the violations of international law, to, in this case, stop the shipment of weapons, stop the cash from flowing, stop the support for for the veto of a ceasefire. And at the same time, accountability and where we need a ceasefire is where we hear about these claims to be supporting and caring about Palestinian lives, making possible. We're actually hearing US officials claiming that they are solely responsible for the short-term pause that we saw a couple of weeks ago that allowed a little bit of aid inside that stopped the bombing for just a few days, when at the same time they are violating those same laws that they claim to be defending. So we need to demand a full level of humanitarian access in the context of a ceasefire. It all comes back right now to the issue of a ceasefire. And then, of course, the United Nations serves as both the venue and an instrument for imposing an end to this genocide, for demanding and imposing a real ceasefire. When we hear from humanitarian institutions, UNRWA, the UN's broader humanitarian agencies, OHCHR and the others, are saying that they are on the verge of not being able to work at all, based on what Hani has been telling us of the challenges facing the UNRWA staff. 138 members of the UNRWA staff have already been killed. We see in the General Assembly vote yesterday how isolated the US and Israeli position is. 153 countries voting for an immediate and lasting ceasefire. Only 10 voting no. Only 10. It's an extraordinary moment. And it's important to recognize that this vote, even though it was in the General Assembly, which ordinarily, and we hear this all the time, is purely advisory. It's not an enforceable resolution. It's not to be taken as seriously as a resolution that would be passed in the Security Council. That's actually not quite accurate, because this vote in the General Assembly was taken under the terms of something called the Uniting for Peace precedent at the United Nations. And under that precedent, ironically, that precedent was set when the US went to the General Assembly when the Security Council was stalled, because the Soviet Union was refusing to call for a United Nations endorsed war in Korea in 1951. And the US instead, when the Soviet delegation was out of the room, went to the General Assembly and said, the Assembly needs to pass this as a uniting for peace. And that's what authorized the US war in Korea in the 1950s. And the precedent of that is that now we can apply that to say that resolutions that are stalled in the Security Council because of a veto, as the call for a ceasefire was vetoed by the by the US last week, that now it's up to the General Assembly to take on an issue of international peace and security that would ordinarily be limited to the Security Council. Under Uniting for Peace, this should be taken as a matter of law. It should be enforceable. But again, that doesn't happen on its own. It's something that is going to need perhaps an arms embargo to enforce a ceasefire, but we're going to have to use the instruments of the United Nations to get to that point. I want to finish with a question to both of you, to both Hani and Craig. We're looking at the issues of humanitarian support and accountability under international law, both being centered at the United Nations. You both have years of experience in and around the United Nations, the UN agencies. What can you tell us? What can you advise us is the basis on which what people and movements can do to strengthen the capacity of the United Nations, the capacity of UNRWA, the funding of UNRWA, all of that, and at the same time, to strengthen UN decisions for a ceasefire? How could we have gotten to a ceasefire sooner? How do we make it enforceable? How do we force the International Criminal Court to get off its stalled refusal to move forward on investigating Israeli violations of international law and crimes against humanity? How do we move on the Convention Against Genocide? Is the focus solely on our own governments? Is there a way of bringing institutional pressure on the United Nations? So I will leave it back to the two of you to talk a little bit more about that. How can we, as people and movements, pressure the UN to do what's required at this devastating moment. Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
Please do. Yes, thank you.
Why don't you go ahead, Hani, because I just spoke.
Great.
So yeah.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks. It's so hard. I'm gonna say this comment as a Palestinian American, not somebody who's affiliated with UNRWA USA. It's hard because when the same country that's giving you the bombs that's killing you is the same one sending you tuna fish cans and canned beans to feed you. It's hard because I try to be a good citizen and try to go talk to Congress in my personal capacity and advocate. Like happened last week, we had an appointment with a member of Congress, and we got there early. 5 minutes before the meeting, he left his office. This is sort of like, this is where you feel frustrated. You talk, you're questioned, you're often attacked, you're, out of the blue, people who don't know you, don't know if they're real people or robots, they attack you for saying feeding a hungry child should not be a political statement. The case of my brother, he was killed by American bombs in an airstrike. Clearly, the Palestinians don't have any planes, but somehow they try to tell you blame some other party, not the people who pulled the trigger. And it's a lot to process. I work independent of UNRWA, the agency. We're UNRWA USA, so we raise funds and awareness for the mission. Been very successful in raising funds for the agency here from individual American generous folks who don't work in the state level. But it is hard. You look at the top 2 donors for UNRWA right now as we speak, since the crisis broke or the war on Gaza, Germany and the UAE. And you understand how upset Palestinians are with some of those countries. And, I try to tell people, engage with folks. We go to Congress, we talk to them. I've taken meetings as big as the White House with national security members and ultimately the one person in a day, he sent me condolences for the killing of my brother. He's in the White House. And the same day he got in TV and he said, we're not for the ceasefire. So there's a big disconnect between the reality we're seeing and the reality or their agenda. It's mainly for white guys who make this policy and the National Security Council. And it doesn't matter. For them, we're just easy to pin us and like it's Hamas's fault and all that. And again, it's just hard because, you come to this country because you want to support your family and do the right thing. We engage, we vote every time we vote. And somehow we feel unheard and unlistened to. This is not, in 2024, we have an election. This is going to hurt a lot of people, not just, the top of the ticket. So it's, we tried in one day, we met with Secretary Blinken and we left the meeting and there was a rally protesting Blinken. We also joined that as American citizens. We're grateful we have this opportunity to meet with the person, the man, and then protest the man. And it's becoming harder because, I have kids here. I want them to go to college. I want them to feel that, they belong. But right now, we don't feel we're told that big tent is gone all of a sudden. So, I know it's an advocacy part. There's a big part. Our team here is doing advocacy to sign, ask for people to talk to members of Congress about the ceasefire. And at last I looked, there's about 65 members of Congress who called for ceasefire. 65. And it's tough. So we're doing that. We're also talking to the media. As far as the UN, they all say the right things. They're 100% calling this out as much as they can, but they're also in a difficult position. It's like, I was in a BBC interview and somebody told me, you voted, you're an American. How do you feel about President Biden? And I said, on the UNRWA level, he's been very helpful because in the previous administration, he funded the organization. So I want to acknowledge that's a good start. But in the personal level, I feel definitely frustrated and disappointed. So it is really hard if you want to be true to yourself and just talk about that. And Craig knows a lot about that. Probably he has more experience. But it is, I feel supported here in the team. Everybody's like we're asking for a humanitarian thing. We're not telling them bring in computer chips into Gaza. We're just saying stop killing them. And somehow we're the bad guys. So I don't want to discourage you, continue to engage this in any ways you can. You could support UNRWA USA, that's one way, but humanitarian is not going to wholly solve it. We're not going to be in a situation where here's a can of tuna and then the next day people are killed. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I mean, shall I go, Khury? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. So, I mean, a lot of what Hani just said, it kind of goes to the root of some of Phyllis's questions, because what you'll often see from the United States and from senior officials of the United Nations is a willingness to talk about humanitarian aid, humanitarian issues, the consequences of their policies. So, that's why you have this absurdity in Gaza, where you have countries that share in the responsibility of unfolding war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, with the other hand providing some amount of humanitarian aid. As a lawyer, I have to say this does not relieve them at all of their international responsibility for what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank. So that needs to be really clear. And I think there is a lot of, as I say, fig leaf harvesting exercises out there from both within the UN and from states like the United States that are trying to create this sort of plausible deniability. Well, we provided some trucks of food and so on. First of all, it's a drop in the ocean. Gaza, before it was destroyed, was relying on 500 trucks a day. Now it's entirely destroyed and they're receiving a trickle of trucks, which are really only symbolic. Let's be honest. Anything helps, but that's and you don't go in and destroy somebody's house and kill them and stop periodically and make a sandwich for them and expect a court of law to say, okay, so we'll let you off the hook. And that really is what is happening here. And so it is that even inside the UN, because of pressure from states like the US and the UK and others, when they deal with the situation in the Middle East, they're very happy to engage in what I think really are smokescreens. Talk about a two-state solution somewhere down the road, set up a quartet to talk about these things. For 30 years plus, that smokescreen has hidden the worst exacerbated continuous dispossession, persecution, apartheid, crimes against humanity, pogroms against Palestinians, and a worsening, a continuous exacerbation of the human rights situation that probably could not have occurred without that smokescreen above them. So the issue is root causes. The issue is human rights. The issue is equality for everybody in the region. And if you are afraid to say that, because you are complicit, as is the US government, or because you're a UN official who's afraid of the US government and other actors, I think you can only expect the situation to get worse. There is, to answer Phyllis's question directly, a problem of pressure on UN officials that has resulted in those UN officials not always implementing their mandated responsibilities under the Charter and under these UN instruments. The answer to that is to make sure that principled voices from civil society who care about human rights and equality are bringing more pressure to bear on the UN than those voices of oppression and inequality. And so far, we are nowhere near that. Now, part of that is institutional because civil society doesn't have the same access that states do in an intergovernmental organization, but there are avenues of access that people need to get into and tear wide open to make sure that the voice of human rights, the voice of equality, the voice of peace is being heard. There are parts of the UN that are not captured. There are independent human rights mechanisms like the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council, the Commission of Inquiry, successive commissions of inquiry, independent treaty bodies, human rights treaty bodies, and people who really care, the engine of the UN, which is those people who are there because they want human rights, they want peace, they want equality, they want an end to poverty, all of those sorts of things. Those people are access points for people on the outside who care and who want to try to make a change in the very horrifying direction that we're seeing now. Security Council is a major problem, as Phyllis hinted. It is something that I think belongs in a Cold War museum. The 5 permanent members, the victors in the Second World War, have given themselves a veto. They have efforts at Security Council reform that would, for example, get them to voluntarily abstain from the use of the veto in cases where we had certified war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing has gone nowhere. None of them want to give up that power. And so the Security Council is always going to be a problem as long as those permanent members don't feel the pressure from below, from their own country, their own constituencies, to behave in a manner consistent with international law, international human rights. And they very clearly do not feel that at all now. As I say, the US government, in its position on the veto and the treatment of the Palestinians, not only are they isolated globally, as Phyllis has pointed out in recent voting, but they are also inconsistent with what the majority of US citizens want to see happening, and yet they feel that they're not accountable. That has to change. Very quickly, the International Criminal Court is a place where action could be pursued, but the International Criminal Court, especially the Office of the Prosecutor, has been politically compromised and corrupted. And the current prosecutor has shown himself unwilling and unable to take a principled position in acting on claims about Palestinian violations of Palestinian human rights brought years ago, and upon which the current prosecutor has been dragging his feet and trying not to act, even as he makes gestures towards Israel to be responsive to what that country is asking for in the current context. He needs to step down. Civil society needs to demand that he step down, and we have to work not to destroy the International Criminal Court, but to try to build it up into something that is not just an extension of Western imperialism that insists on accountability for African perpetrators, but refuses to have accountability for perpetrators in the global North and in the West, like Israeli perpetrators. Finally, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, is explicitly mandated in the Genocide Convention to take cases relating to violations of the Genocide Convention. That is a state-to-state court. It only takes one country, and all countries in the world are parties to the statute of the World Court, International Court of Justice, and any one of them could bring a case for genocide against Israel in this current case. I'm sure it's being discussed. In the International Criminal Court, you've got several states that are bringing cases against Israel for its genocide and war crimes. And I suspect that ultimately that will happen with regard to the International Court of Justice as well. But you can also, these are crimes of universal jurisdiction. You can bring cases in any third-party court in any country. So if the political pressure of the US prevents international institutions from doing what they're mandated to do, this can happen in any court around the world. I'll stop there on that question. Sorry.
Well, that's incredibly helpful. And I'll just as we wrap up, most of the questions folks ask are about this question of accountability. And given the fact that the ICC is compromised, as Craig says, given the structural problem of the Security Council, folks want to know what are other mechanisms that could be pursued to hold Israel and the U.S. accountable, and in particular, what are relevant to those of us in civil society. So if folks want to respond to those questions, that'd be really helpful.
Who's going first?
Phyllis, go ahead.
Well, just very briefly, because we just have another minute or two. I think that what we've seen in other cases, sometimes where they've won, more often where they have not, but they've mobilized a level of popular support for the concepts of international law and recognition of the role of civil society in using international law at the United Nations. Things like the Genocide Convention being brought to the International Court of Justice. That's not going to happen until public opinion and mobilized public opinion in a number of cases in a number of countries is strong enough to force a government to do it. That's really what it's all about. It's for us in the United States, the way we're fighting for a ceasefire, to get the United States, our own government, to stop opposing a ceasefire and stop collaborating with the assault on Palestinian lives that is underway right now. That's happening in some other countries. So I think that's the link between civil society and the United Nations. We have just a minute or two left, so I'm going to stop and let Hani and Craig have the last words.
Hani.
Very quickly, I mean, the feedback I'm hearing from the old country is they don't really believe in any of these things apply to Israel. I mean, who killed Shireen Abu Akleh? Did anybody ever go to prison? Remember the Goldstein report? Anything happened there? I mean, you see it, it's a genocide in real time, and then everybody acts like, oh, no, it's normal, it's okay. I mean, I don't think, please don't waste my time as a Palestinian with family in Gaza talking about these things, because they really apply to everybody else, but not the situation. And I share some of the frustration people have in the street. It goes even to organizations like the Red Cross. They say, we never see them, they never to come to rescue us, but all of a sudden, whenever there is an Israeli hostage, we see them, they look nice, and they have their vehicles. This is the reality my family has been praying to save my cousin Tasneem. She's in the hospital in Kamal Adwan, no hospital, no light, and nobody's coming to take her to a safe place to receive medical attention. So I just want to really, like, I don't mean this as a this, but that's what the Palestinians, the feedback I'm hearing, and that's how I'm personally feeling right now.
Appreciate that, Hani. Craig?
Well, and that's perfectly understandable, because it's true that the entire world has failed the Palestinians, and the horrors that we see happening on the ground are a testament to that. I mean, I think we've said that there's a problem with international institutions, and that's why we need to engage those international institutions to bring pressure on them to counterbalance the pressure that's coming from the impunity advocates in this case. But at the same time, Phyllis is right. This is about movements. I remember very well the movement against apartheid in South Africa that was being supported by the government of the United States right up through the 1980s. And what changed in the United States, what changed in Europe, was movements, was churches in significant measure, and synagogues, and civil society organizations, and movements, and boycotts, and divestment, and sanctions. Yes, insisting on legal accountability in courts, and so on. Yes, bringing pressure in international institutions to set up mechanisms to oppose apartheid, as they need to do in this case as well. So we need massive demonstrations. We need civil disobedience. We need engagement with political institutions. We need boycott, divestment, sanctions. We need institutional accountability for our own government actors, but also for international institutions, so that the ICC can't get away with political corruption, so that the UN can't get away with being weak on these issues. And I should say as well, we also need accountability for the media. I remember very well that there have been cases, in the Nuremberg Tribunal, in the Rwanda Tribunal, where media were held accountable for disseminating incitement to genocide as well. And we need corporate accountability. These companies that are making a fortune arming a genocide and providing high-tech support to surveillance and genocidal actions and so on. Many of them are based right here in this country. So all of these pieces brought together, I think, can build a righteous roar from the people of this country to stop the complicity of the United States government. And I'll finish where I started, without which war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide committed by Israel could not occur.
Well, we can't thank you all enough for your insights and your expertise, your knowledge, and thank you all to the audience for joining us. And let's keep up the work. Thank you, and take care, everybody.
Thank you.